Hi there, everybody. This is Jeremy Siskind. I'm the author of these two books over here, but you might also be interested to know I've got this new book called Jazz Piano Fundamentals, Volume 2 out. There is also a Jazz Piano Fundamentals Volume 1, and actually, as of now, you can buy them both together for a reduced price as a digital book on my website. So if you want them both, instead of being like $20 each or something, it's only they're like less than 30 for both of them. And then I've got everybody's favorite book, Playing Solo Jazz Piano. And today I want to do a pretty deep dive on just a subject that I'm always getting questions about and always needs a lot of explaining because they're very confusing, and that's the subject of half-diminished chords. If you don't know what half-diminished chords sound like, they sound like this. Now, interestingly, Dizzy Gillespie famously said that there's no such thing as a half-diminished chord. He said that what people were calling half-diminished chords were just minor six chords in first inversion. Not first inversion, minor six chords with the six in the bass. My apologies. So this would be like an E flat minor six. E flat minor six. If we put that sixth into the bass, then we get what we think of as a half-diminished chord. And so, of course, we do defer to Dizzy Gillespie, but a lot of modern theorists call this a half-diminished chord, and it is easier than saying E flat minor 6 over C. But maybe I get ahead of myself a little bit. So half-diminished chords are equivalent to minor seventh chords with a flat fifth. This is my number one overview portion. Ta-da, the razzle-dazzle technology, so fancy. Okay, so as an overview, half-diminished is basically the same as minor seventh flat five. I guess I haven't ever looked up why they're called half-diminished, and I'm sure there's going to be somebody more wise than me, more educated than me in the comments, so feel free. But I've always thought of it this way, why they're called half-diminished. So here I have a D minor 7 chord, right? If we're in treble clef. Yeah, such a professional production here. Just totally winging it. And then over here, this is a D diminished chord, right? And so halfway between the two of these, what do we have to do to get from the minor 7th to the diminished? We have to lower the 7th and lower the 5th, okay? And so the half-diminished chord only does one out of those two things. It lowers the 5th, and then to get fully diminished, we lower the 7th. So again, this would be D minor 7, this would be D half-diminished 7th, and then this would be D fully diminished 7th. Now, the two most common ways to indicate a half-diminished chord are what I just briefly showed you, which is a little circle, like the diminished circle with a line through it diagonally. Line through it diagonally. I always think it looks kind of like a cool superhero shield, and I always thought there should be like a half-diminished man as a superhero, but that's maybe my own thing. Or you'll commonly see, and usually in the real book is written as D minor 7 flat 5. If I were to get really theory nerd, I could think of reasons why these could be different, but functionally, I really would not treat them differently. I would treat them as absolutely one and the same. I would treat them as totally the same. But those are the two ways that you're going to see to indicate a half-diminished chord. How would you find a half-diminished chord? I would take a minor 7th chord and lower the 5th. If you're an unusual person who's more comfortable with diminished chords, you could take a diminished chord and raise the 7th. But to me, that's kind of weird. So again, those two ways would be to take a minor 7th chord. So if it's D half diminished, take D minor 7th, lower the 5th. Or if you're a weirdo, no judgment here, we like freaks, we can take a diminished chord and then raise that 7th by a half step. So again, and I'll go to my little video cam. Oh, is this going to be on? Oh, it works. So here's a D half diminished. Here's F half diminished. Here's A flat half diminished. I'm sorry about the spelling on that. I don't get to control flats and sharps. B flat half diminished. E half diminished, etc. And Debussy was actually a lover of half-diminished chords. One of the things that I do if I'm trying to do a Debussy impression is that I will just double. Actually, I should go back to that other camera angle. I would just double between the hands. I know it's hard to read all those notes, but I'm playing two identical F half diminished. And that's just E half diminished, nothing fancy at all. It's kind of interesting, might not be that interesting, I don't know, to note that a half diminished chord makes up the 3rd, 5th, 7th, and 9th of a dominant 7th chord. So there's a very strong relationship between E half diminished and C7. Which maybe brings us to the next thing on our agenda here, which is functions. How do half diminished chords function? And in a major key, we do have a diatonic half diminished chord. We rarely see it used in this way, but the diatonic chord based on the 7th note in a major key is half diminished technically. And I say that relates because let's take that E half diminished I was just showing you. That would be the 7 in the key of F, right? If we put that C below it, now we get the 5 chord in the key of F. And so that 7, I should really call it half diminished 7th, is strongly related to a 5 chord. And when we talk about half diminished, it depends on the key center, but when we talk about a 7 in a major key, if it has any function, it's going to be a dominant kind of a function. It's going to pull us back to the tonic. But we don't really hear that chord in major keys much. It's in minor keys where we hear half diminished chords quite a lot, and they have 2 possible functions. The biggest one is as a 2 chord, and this is going to come up everywhere in jazz standards. In a minor 2-5-1, the 2 in that 2-5-1 should properly be a half diminished chord. I'll say that one more time. In a minor 2-5-1, the 2 in a minor key should be a half diminished chord. The other place that this does fall in a minor scale, though, is as a 6. Right, so let's take the key of D minor. B half diminished is one potential 6 chord. And this can be really nice if we're going from 1 to 6. They're going to have the same notes because of that Dizzy Gillespie principle, right? I showed you, here's a D minor 6, and then we're going to go, so that's D, F, A, B. We're going to go to B half diminished. Same notes, just different organization, different inversion. And then we can do our 2-5. So, sometimes I'm talking to students and I'm like, well, that's a 1-2-5 or a 1-6-2-5. And they say, wait, don't you have to decide? It's kind of like, not really, because all that's going to change is that the bass note, the inversion is going to change there, right? So those 2 chords are pretty gosh darn interchangeable. Okay, but that 2 chord is really where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. That's where we need to put most of our energy. But we'll discuss both of those chords in a sec. All right, now the big question: what is the proper 9th for a half diminished chord? And this gets really, really tricky for the 2 chord. And so let's stay in the key of D minor. So the 2 chord here would be E half diminished. And let's go back to this angle. Okay, so here's your E half diminished. Now, if we're thinking in the key, so the 9th has to be some kind of an F, right? That would be where we get to the 9th note of the scale. So if we're thinking in the key of D minor, it really clearly has to be an F natural, right? Because that's the 3rd of the key. That's a really important note. But as we put that note in, at least in this sort of a voicing, it's pretty clashy. We're missing some of the buffer notes that might make that kind of lower ninth feel more consonant. So frequently we use what I call the upper ninth, which would be F sharp. It's outside the key, but it's a lot more consonant. It's a lot more colorful. Other times, we totally avoid the ninth. And usually in voicings, we're going to replace the ninth with just the root. So all three are possible. I'm going to play you Beautiful Love. Okay. So there I paused on the chord, but now I'm using that lower ninth, the one from the key that's a little more dissonant. It's very dark. But in context, if we're not playing a ballad, if we're not really holding it really slow, I think it's actually a really nice dark color. The raised ninth also works. I'm gonna hold it, right? Big splash of color. Or we avoid it altogether, we play the root. A slightly more pure sound. And I am not a believer that one is better than the other. I think all three are really good options. I think the raised ninth, the F sharp in this case, sounds more modern. I think the lower ninth sounds more dark. And like I said, that using the root, leaving out any ninths, gives it a really pure kind of a sound. Now, it's really important to treat either ninth, the raised or the lower, the upper or the lower, as a non-chord tone, meaning resolve it. So that F, as you go to the A7, the F sharp wants to pull down to an F natural as the flat 13 of the A. Similarly, if we use the lower ninth, it really wants to pull down from F to E. Okay? If you don't resolve it, it's going to sound like a non-chord tone that's going unresolved, which is another way to say that is it's a wrong note. So I'm definitely of the opinion that you can use any of those three options as long as you resolve it correctly. The root does not need to be resolved. The root just sounds fine. It's a neutral note. It doesn't have any kind of a pull. So, the qualifications resolve it. Upper ninth sounds more modern. In a ballad, I'm generally gonna avoid that lower ninth, the one that clashes, because we're gonna really hear that clash in a ballad. Okay. So let's look now if I'm coming up with a voicing. So this is C half diminished. In half-diminished chords, and this is true for diminished chords, I think I'm going to do a deep dive on diminished chords next, I am much more open to doublings than I am in other situations, because we just have our hands kind of tied. If we decide that we're not going to use the ninth, we have to use the root. We can also talk about, we don't really have a 13th for this chord. The 11th is a very welcome note. The 11th, you definitely can use. But if I'm trying, if I'm starting with this basic voicing and I want to expand it, I could add that upper ninth on top. But if I really want to keep it simple, I'm just going to put a root on top. If I want to expand it beyond that, maybe I would put the 11th up here. We could substitute out one or both of those roots for a ninth, but again, that's all going to kind of depend on what you want to do with that note. Same thing if I'm going to have the 7th on bottom. might do something like that for a 5-note voicing. This is still C half diminished. Now, let's just rewind for a second, because one thing that's very interesting is that the ninth does change based on function. Okay, so if we're thinking in D minor again, I know I'm just like bouncing back and forth between a bunch of keys. If I have a B half diminished, now if I'm taking the ninth from the key, it's going to be a C sharp, because we're always, when we create harmonies, we're always thinking about the leading tone, using a leading tone in a minor key. So here, if you're on the 6th chord instead of the 2 chord, you actually do have a ninth that you can use that's right from the key. So it's a very subtle distinction, but you do kind of need to know not just what is the chord, but what's the function of that chord. Now, I do know some people who encourage voicing half diminished chords with that flat 5 on bottom, I think. This is not something that I do. I'm just sharing something I hear around the old water cooler, that they might voice the chord kind of the opposite of how I'd usually do it. And I think the idea here is this is exactly how I would voice an E flat minor. This would be my voicing for an E flat minor 6, so it could also work for that C half diminished. And it does work, but I always kind of get stuck on like, what's my voice leading going to be from there? I guess, I could kind of figure something out, but I'm generally teaching, and for myself, I'm generally trying to keep the 3rd or 7th on bottom. So just sharing, some people like the sound of that better. Cool. And then number 5 is just going to be about scales. I'm a simple man, but I'm aware of 3 scales that we very prominently use with half diminished chords. The first one, I think, so here I am in C. We're thinking, excuse me. So let's start here. This is what we call C Locrian, right? Locrian is the 7th mode of the major scale. And so this is like a D flat major scale starting on C. Very, very dark. It's of course got that flat 5, which is such a key element. So this scale would go with those moments where you either use the root as the 9th or have the flat, the lowered 9th, right? Because that D flat is the lowered 9th for C. Okay. Second scale, I've heard it identified a few different ways. I like to just say Locrian raised 2. Sometimes I hear Locrian natural 2 or even Locrian sharp 2. And it's just like the Locrian, but as you guessed, the second note is no longer lowered. And this goes with that version of the half diminished where you're going to use the upper 9th, the 9th that's outside of the key. By the way, I believe this is the 6th mode of the melodic minor. So this scale is equivalent to the E flat melodic minor. So if you prefer to think of it that way, have at it. A little bit more of a modern sound than the Locrian. And then lastly, if we get rid of the A flat, this is the 2nd mode of the harmonic minor, which I've heard called a bunch of different things. I just call it harmonic minor mode 2. I'm sure you guys have some fancy names. This is one of the things you learn when you're writing books. You can just name anything, and who's gonna say no? So this is like B flat harmonic minor. Oh, sorry, I need to add a D flat. My bad. This is harmonic minor mode 2. B flat harmonic minor, which is great if you're trying to just use one scale for a 2-5-1. Harmonic minor is a pretty good way to go. This is for a minor 2-5-1. So this is a little bit unique because it has an upper 13th. It has a raised 13th. And of course you can hear whenever we're using a harmonic minor scale or a mode, we're going to have this augmented second sound. Which bothers some people, doesn't bother some people. Some people try to avoid, some people try to highlight. It's really up to you. So let me play a minor 2-5-1, and I'm going to use Locrian first. Here's Locrian natural too. And then here's this harmonic minor. So they each have slightly different sounds, but it's all going to be about the second and the sixth note of the scale. Everything else is staying the same, but the action is going to be with the second and the sixth. All right, there you go. You're masters now of the half-diminished chord. Just a reminder, if you enjoyed this, there actually is a lot about the half-diminished here in Jazz Piano Fundamentals Book 2. You can get both books at a discount from my website. So check it out, and I'll see you later.